Thank you very much, everybody, for joining the seminar. My name is Steffen Oppel. I used to be a scientist at the RSPB and worked in a big BirdLife International project on Egyptian vultures. This project started in 2016 and included partner organizations in 15 different countries. It was led by the Bulgarian BirdLife partner, BSPB, and I will today present some results from this project. Right now, I work at the Swiss Ornithological Institute, where I study the dispersal of other raptors, red kites, and golden eagles, and little owls. But the Egyptian vulture dominated my life for the last 10 years, and today I want to present you some of this work. The talk will be structured into two halves. The first one deals mostly with estimating the cost of migration, and the second part of the talk then explains how we use that information in the management for the Egyptian vulture along its entire flyway. And this work wouldn't have been possible without the funding of the EU LIFE program and the support of hundreds of people in 14 countries along the flyway, and I'll mention them all at the end. So to start off, let's remind ourselves how important migration is and what trade-offs there exist in migration. So when birds migrate from one continent to another, they need to travel over unknown terrain, and these journeys can be very risky and lead to lots of mortality, especially for inexperienced juveniles who do this for the first time. They fly over unfamiliar terrain, they need to find food, they need to find places where to rest, and naturally this causes quite a lot of mortality. So in the evolution of migration, it's important that the increase in mortality that is caused by birds moving long distances is somehow offset, and usually this is offset by higher reproduction. So birds migrate from one place to another to exploit more resources where they can have higher reproductive success, which then offsets the cost of the migration. So that's the theory of how migration originally evolved, by birds starting to travel to places where they have seasonally abundant resources, where they can have more reproductive output, and offset the cost of moving from one place to another by exploiting these seasonally abundant resources. And this is a very stable strategy as long as the benefits of migration outweigh its costs. So as long as you survive better when you move to a different place, or you have more offspring when you move to a different place, then migration is a very stable strategy. But it is no longer if staying in the same place affords you the same fitness as moving long distances. So to test whether this is actually a valid ecological trade-off, we need to somehow quantify how costly migration actually is. So how much does the mortality for birds that migrate increase compared to those birds that don't migrate? And this is actually a very difficult subject to study, simply because most birds that migrate, you can't study them by telling them not to migrate. So the one way to study that subject was to compare populations of species that are resident in one part of their range and migrants in another part of their range. So this graph shows you results of a study that was done on Egyptian vultures in the left graph and red kites in the right graph, where the authors compared the populations that live on Mediterranean islands. These are the black symbols, Minorca and the Canary Islands in the Atlantic. So the The Egyptian vultures are resident on those islands. They don't migrate away from those islands. And compared the survival of those birds to the survival of birds from the same species from mainland Spain that migrate to Africa. And for the red kites, this was compared with red kites from Switzerland compared to the populations that are resident on islands in the Mediterranean. And what you can see here on this graph is that the black symbols for the Egyptian vulture are always higher than the white symbols for pretty much all age classes except the adult breeders. So there seems to be a cost of migration, especially in the younger birds, but once they're established, there is pretty much no difference between birds that migrate and birds that don't migrate. And that seems to be the same for the red kites. Now, another way to study the cost of migration, because if you compare different populations, they might also be exposed to different environments and all sorts of other things might differ between these populations. If you want to explore it in a single population, then you need to capture the bird several times per year. And in this study led by Rob Robinson, they studied the seasonal survival of alpine swifts in Switzerland by catching the birds several times over the year so that you can then estimate both the survival during the season when they're in Switzerland breeding and while they're on migration. And you can see that the survival during the breeding season, which is here in light gray, is slightly higher than the survival during the non-breeding season when the birds are in wintering grounds and on migration. Now, for the last 20 years, we have enjoyed advances in technology that now make it much, much easier to actually track birds and monitor their survival almost in real time. So we no longer rely on catching ringed birds once or twice a year to estimate whether they have survived or not. We're now able to attach GPS transmitters on large animals that send us locations every few minutes or hours. And with those modern transmitters, we can assess whether the birds are alive or dead almost continuously. And we can use that to figure out when birds are dying and whether that happens mostly during migration or outside of migration. And in this study led by Fabrizio Sergio on black kites, you can see on the left-hand graph the decline in the number of birds that survive for a particular time period. And the red line is during the southward migration, and you can see that it declines very rapidly. So the survival probability is very low. Lots of birds die early on. Whereas in the wintering quarters and in the breeding quarters, the survival is much, much higher. So there seems to be much less mortality when the birds are stationary, either in winter or in summer, compared to when they're on migration. So we wanted to find out what the cost of migration is for the Egyptian vulture. And the Egyptian vulture is of great interest because it's a globally endangered species. And it's widely distributed across Southern Europe, but with very differing population trends. So we have a cluster in the Iberian Peninsula, in Western Europe, in Southern France, Spain, and Portugal, where the population is more or less stable. In some parts, it's even increasing. There are still some parts where the population is declining, but by and large, the population in Western Europe is doing reasonably well. And then we have a population in Eastern Europe that is in enormous trouble and has been declining massively over the past decades and has actually gone extinct in the northern parts of the Balkans and disappeared from many areas where they used to breed previously. So it's an interesting case study to test whether the cost of migration may differ between these two populations and may actually explain the two different population trajectories that these populations exhibit. Now, why would the cost of migration explain the different population trends? For that, it's useful to look at the migration routes, and this map shows you the routes of GPS-tracked Egyptian vultures that were marked at those yellow dots that you see on the map. And in red, you see the spring migration. So that's the migration that the birds take when they come from African wintering grounds and migrate to breeding areas in Europe. And in blue, you see the autumn migration when the birds migrate from breeding grounds in Europe back to Africa. And what you can see is that in Western Europe, the birds have a fairly straight migration route. They just go straight south and they winter in Mauritania and Mali, and they don't have to bypass any major bottlenecks. Whereas in Eastern Europe, if the birds migrate south, they end up in the Mediterranean Sea, which is a large body of water. And for a soaring migrant like the Egyptian vulture, that is a very significant barrier that they cannot cross. So lots of birds drown in the Mediterranean Sea. Those are the tracks that end here. And the actual migration to get to Africa is quite convoluted. You have to travel around Turkey and around the Middle East and around the Red Sea to get to Africa. So it's much more complicated. And we were wondering whether this might be a reason for why the populations in Eastern Europe are faring worse than the populations in Western Europe. So our goals in this study were whether the survival is lower during migration than during stationary periods, to figure out whether migration is actually the problem for these populations, and whether the shorter and more direct migration of Egyptian vultures in Western Europe can explain the differences in the population status. And lastly, we wanted to know where and how mortality occurs to then actually fix some problems and help the population in the Balkans. So to do that, we worked with partners in Europe and in Africa to catch lots of Egyptian vultures, more than 130. More than half of those were juveniles that were marked in their nests. And we also had some immatures and some adults. And amongst those birds were also 51 that were reared from captivity and released in the wild. And I get to that later in the talk. We equipped those birds with GPS, GSM transmitters that are all solar powered and attached with a harness. So these devices don't fall off. And if nothing bad happens, they can operate for 7 to 10 years because they get charged by a solar panel and the birds transmit their positions. So with that, we have almost continuous information for these birds for many years. Now, to estimate whether there is a cost of migration on survival, we first use the tracking data to define whether a bird migrated in a month. And for that, we just plotted the distance that a bird moved in a particular month. And if it moved a certain distance every month, then we classified the bird to be on migration during that month. And if it didn't move a certain distance, then we termed that phase resident. And we then used a very complicated multi-event model to estimate whether a bird was alive in a given month or not. And the reason why you need a complicated model to estimate that is because you cannot really observe it perfectly. So when a bird is transmitting positions and you know that the bird is moving, then you know it's alive. But sometimes you don't get any data from the bird. And then there are several options. Either the bird is dead or the tag has stopped working. And we try to account for all this uncertainty in this model, which has 3 possible states the bird can be in. It can either be alive with a functioning tag, it can be dead, or it can be alive without the tag. and we can find birds either alive or dead. And then there's a few states in between where we don't really know what happened. And the model helps us to estimate the probability that the bird is still alive, accounting for all the other uncertainty. And we then use that model to test for the effect of migration and geography by including those factors, whether the bird migrated in a month or not, and the latitude it was in, to estimate the monthly survival probability. So these are the results. On the map here on the left, you see the tracks of all the birds, and the yellow dots are those birds where we know they died. So these birds were found or otherwise certified to be dead. The green dots are birds where the transmitter failed. So these birds were later seen alive, but did not transmit any data anymore. And the blue dots are those where we don't know what happened. We just lost the signal to the bird. It may be alive, it may have died. We didn't see it again, so we don't know what happened. And the graph on the right-hand side summarizes the number of losses in 3 different latitudinal bands. So below 20 degrees north, so that's south of the Sahara, then in the Middle East between 20 and 30 degrees north, and then in Europe, north of 30 degrees north. And those bars are related to the number of tracking years over which we track birds in those areas. And what you can see is that the number of dead birds per tracking year is the highest in the breeding grounds. So north of 30 degrees north, we have a large number of mortalities, even though the birds don't spend a huge amount of time. We also see mortalities in Africa, but the young birds especially, they can spend much more time in Africa because some of them spent the first 4 years in Africa without ever migrating back. And so the number of deaths per tracking year is actually lower in Africa than in Europe. Now, the survival that we estimated was remarkably unaffected by migration. So the graph on the left-hand side shows you the monthly survival probability of birds. The blue dots are those for migratory birds, and the green ones are those for stationary birds. And for the adult birds, which is in the top panel, you can see that there's almost no difference between birds migrating and those birds when they're not migrating. For the juvenile birds in the lower panel, we see a marked difference between the populations. So in Western Europe, that's the population that has a very straight and short migration route, which is very easy to find even for juveniles. We also see no difference between the migrating and the stationary birds, but in Italy and in the Balkans, so in Eastern Europe, where the birds have to migrate around the Mediterranean Sea and they have to find a way where they don't fall into the sea. For those birds, we actually see lower survival during migration than during stationary periods, simply because their migration is so complicated. And you can see that on this graph. So this projects the survival probability, the monthly survival probability over age for the first 4 years of a young vulture from Eastern Europe. So you can see that survival increases with age. As the birds get older, they are better to survive every month. But you can also see the massive difference between migration, that's the yellow line, which is a lot lower than the resident periods, either north of 25 degrees north, so that's in the breeding grounds, or in Africa, south of 25 degrees north. That's where the birds are in wintering areas and where they spend a large portion of their first few years. So we see a lower survival during migration. We see a generally higher survival in the south, and we see that survival increases with age. So from that, we can conclude that for the Egyptian vultures in Europe, it is actually beneficial to migrate to Africa because their survival probability in Africa is higher than it is in Europe. So the cost of migration is generally offset by the higher survival that you enjoy when you're in Africa. So there's a benefit to migrating to Africa. And that benefit is highest for adult birds and for birds in Western Europe, which have no migration or no survival cost for migration. So the only survival cost that we found is for juveniles that face a significant barrier, like the juvenile Egyptian vultures in Eastern Europe that have to navigate around the Mediterranean Sea. And it's a combination of migration and anthropogenic mortality. So on the one hand, we have higher migration costs on survival in the East, but we also found way more anthropogenic mortality in terms of poisoning, electrocution, and direct persecution that likely explains the differences in population trajectory between the Eastern and the Western population. So that brings me to the second part of the talk, which is whether humans have actually affected this delicate trade-off. So I've just shown you that the survival for the vultures would be higher in Africa than in Northern Europe, which means it is beneficial to migrate to Africa. But now with increased human mortality, that trade-off may have become out of balance. This map shows you for the birds that we tagged in the Balkans, the cause of death on a map. And the symbols are a bit small, but the round points are persecution, so birds being shot in Niger or in Iraq. We have electrocution mortality, which is very high in breeding grounds, but also in places like Ethiopia and the Middle East. And we have poisoning, which is also a big problem along the entire flyway. So more than half of all the known mortalities of the Egyptian vultures that we tracked were caused by humans. And this table lists all the different threats and the importance of threats in the different countries along the flyway where we work. So the darker red the cell is, the more important is a threat in a particular country. And you can see that in Europe, poisoning is one of the most important problems for Egyptian vultures in those 4 countries in the Balkans. In the Middle East, it is either electrocution and collision or direct persecution in some countries where a lot of illegal killing takes place and many migrants are shot on migration. And in Africa, we have a combination of different problems. We have electrocution and collision, mostly from a rapidly expanding network in Ethiopia and in Egypt. We have the problem of poisoning. And we have the problem of direct persecution in Niger and Nigeria, which is mostly driven by the market demand for vulture products in Nigeria that is met by basically importing the vultures from neighboring countries. So it's a different reason for direct persecution than we see in the Middle East. Now, that is a lot of threats in a lot of different places, and it's very, very difficult to turn them all off in a reasonable amount of time. So what was our strategy to save the Egyptian vulture on the Balkans before it became extinct? One solution that we thought about was that we could simply reinforce the population. So there are so many challenges in trying to reduce poisoning, electrocution, and direct persecution. We're not able to turn off all these threats within a few years. So we needed more time. And one way to buy more time was to release captive bred birds in the Balkans to delay the extinction of the population there. So the question was, how many birds do we need to release? And how do we avoid the high mortality that we have seen in the juvenile birds migrating from the Balkans? So I just explained to you that there is a cost of migration for the birds from the Balkans, and that cost and that mortality was highest for the juveniles on the first autumn migration, and for those birds that fledged from nests in the Western Balkans, so in Western Greece and in Albania and in North Macedonia, those birds are more likely to migrate straight south and then fall into the Mediterranean Sea, whereas those birds that breed in the Eastern Balkans and the Eastern Rhodopes of Bulgaria, they were more likely to make it to the mainland in Turkey and then actually follow the coast around the Mediterranean and get to Africa. So based on that finding, we released birds in Eastern Bulgaria, and we also tested how to release the birds. So we tried whether we release them either in cross-fostered nests or just hacking them, which means just putting them into the wild at a young age and let them embark on their first migration at the same age as wild juveniles. And that was measure that is widely adopted in Israel, and it also worked for the birds in the Balkans, is the delayed release, where the birds are hatched in captivity in July of a given year. They're then kept in captivity until they're almost a year old, and they're released on the breeding grounds in May of the following year. So they then have much more time to adapt and find their way around in the wild and find food during the northern summer between May and September before they start to migrate. And this graph shows you the probability of survival for those different strategies. And the delayed release strategy, which is the red line here in the top, shows very clearly that the success of surviving the first few months is much, much greater for the delayed release than for any of the other measures. So we reintroduced the juveniles in the Eastern Balkans in the spring of the second calendar year, and a big release aviary was built. So the birds were brought from the captive rearing center into this place on the hillside, and then gradually released to adapt to living in the wild. And this seems to work really well. Now, we wanted to know how many we have to release and estimate how the population would be doing depending on how many captive bred birds we released every year. For that, we used the juvenile and the immature survival data from the tracking data, and we have nest monitoring data and adult survival from territory monitoring from the Balkan population that we could all use in a population model. So we used an integrated population model that we adapted from colleagues in France, and that has 6 different age classes that are connected by different rates of surviving. And we informed all these parameters by either our territory monitoring data or by the tracking data. And that model then allowed us to estimate how the population would be doing 30 years into the future under different scenarios. So we projected the Egyptian vulture population into the future based on releasing any number of juveniles up to 15 for the next 10, 20, or 30 years, because that was sort of the main question that we had. How many birds do we have to release for how long to stabilize the population? And we also simulated that we would improve the annual survival of birds by up to 8% due to conservation measures like refurbishing power lines and trying to remove poison baits from the landscape and working with hunters to reduce direct persecution. This graph shows you the output of this model. So on the y-axis is the number of territorial Egyptian vultures in the Balkans, which starts in 2006 when there were more than 200, and it has dropped precipitously to about 100 in 2018. And the future projection is based on the number of captive bred juvenile birds that are released every year from 0 to 50. And what you can see is that the population continues to decline. It obviously it declines steeper if you don't release any birds, but releasing even up to 15 birds alone is not going to save the population. And the reason for that is that the mortality in the wild is simply too high. So without improving survival in the wild, we would not be able to stabilize that population regardless of how many birds we release, because they will suffer the same mortality in the wild as all their wild counterparts. So we started several more simulations, and this graph shows you the future population growth rate. The red line is 1, so we want the future population growth rate above that red line to have a stable population. And in the columns are the improvement rates for the survival, so from none on the left to +8% on the right. And then the 3 lines are releasing juveniles for 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years. And on the x-axis is the number of captive bred birds that are released every year. And what you can see is that if you don't improve survival, this is the panels on the left, the population growth rate never clears the red line. So the population will not grow. And it's only when you improve survival by at least 4% and you release about 5 to 10 birds every year that you get to a stable population. And if you improve survival in the wild by 8%, then you don't need to release any captive bred birds in the population anymore, because the population would grow by itself. So from that, we had a very good idea how many birds we need to release in the wild and by how much we would need to improve survival. And we knew that without improving survival, we wouldn't be able to rescue the population. And how do you reduce mortality in the wild? This was the main focus of the Egyptian Vulture New Life project, and it included an enormous amount of work by many partners in many countries. It included dog patrols to remove poison in the Balkans. It included power line refurbishment, where we insulate dangerous power lines to reduce electrocution in 8 countries. And in total, I think we insulated almost 2,000 power poles across various countries, and the number is growing by the day. And there were multiple actions in many countries to reduce the direct persecution, whether it'll be by hunters in Lebanon or by reducing the market demand on markets in Nigeria. And this work was all done by a lot of partners along the flyway, and they did an absolutely amazing job. And the reason I know that they did an absolutely amazing job is because when we plot the population trajectory of the Balkan Egyptian vulture population, we can see that the population has changed. The population growth rate has changed since that flyway conservation project started. So we started the project in 2017, and it took a while before we actually started to insulate power lines and remove poison from the landscape. But this graph shows you the decline of the number of breeding Egyptian vultures in the Balkans. And since 2018, the population has been stable. So that's a great success. And that was only possible because we worked across many, many countries to remove the threats to the survival of Egyptian vultures. So what are some of the wider implications for the conservation of migratory birds that we have learned from this Egyptian vulture project? The first thing is that there isn't a single solution to save the Egyptian vultures. They're threatened by so many different problems in so many different places that the population basically declines due to death by 1,000 cuts. There is a bird that gets shot here. There's another bird that gets electrocuted in Turkey. There is a bird that gets poisoned in Greece. There is another bird that gets hit by a car somewhere. There's lots and lots of threats pretty much across the entire flyway. And migrants like the Egyptian vulture that can travel through more than 40 countries over their lifetime, they're exposed to such a broad variety of threats across a huge geographic area. There isn't a single solution. We can't just release some birds from captivity in one place, or we can't just do one thing in one location and hope that it will help the population. We have to work as a team across the entire flyway to reduce threats that threaten these birds across all the countries they migrate through. But if you do that, if you actually implement broad front conservation action and reduce threats across different continents, then it is actually possible to reverse the fortune of even such a migratory species. And that is what we've shown. And I take a lot of strength from that if we work together in a big team and everybody does a little bit in each country, then we can actually turn things around. And it's very nice to see that the Egyptian vulture population is now stable. But it's not that they would remain stable if we stopped our work and patted ourselves on the back and went home. We can only reduce survival by ongoing work. Somebody needs to go out all the time to remove poison from the landscape. Somebody needs to go out all the time and work with hunters and market traders to reduce the number of vultures that are being shot and sold. And that requires ongoing work. So this will not stop, and the population will be happily stable ever after, unless we continue the very hard work that has gone into actually making it happen in the first place. Now, in terms of future research, there are a few things that would be great to address, and this brings me back to the trade-off of the cost of migration. In particular, we have very little information on Egyptian vultures from Africa. So we don't know what their breeding success is. And we don't actually know whether there is a benefit of birds migrating from Africa to Europe. So our prediction would be that the breeding success of Egyptian vultures in Africa is lower than the breeding success and the productivity of Egyptian vultures in Europe, because that must be the reason for them to migrate to a place where they have lower survival. So it would be fantastic if anybody wanted to do studies on the breeding success of Egyptian vultures in Africa. And another question is whether there is a reproductive or a survival benefit for juveniles to actually return to where they were born. And I show you the track of an individual bird. The two maps are all one individual bird over the first 5 winters. And you can see that the bird travels through many, many different countries on its migration. And then in the left-hand panel, you see all the wintering areas that it explored over the first few years. So it spent 1 winter in Niger and Nigeria, and then a winter in Chad, and then a winter in Sudan, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, and then it went back to Chad, and eventually it settled to winter in Chad for the rest of its life. But over the first few years of its life, the Egyptian vultures that we've tracked, they visit 40 to 50 countries. And so it'd be very interesting to see what actually drives them to go back to where they came from, and whether that is beneficial for them, or whether it wouldn't be more beneficial for them to end up somewhere else. So with that, I would like to thank all the partners in this project. as I mentioned, we worked in more than 20 countries. Hundreds of people were involved in this study, and especially in reducing the mortality on the ground. It was a fantastic collaborative effort. The survival study was mostly led by Evan Büchli, and together with collaborators from the Middle East, Ron Efrat and Pascual Lopez Lopez, we were able to do fantastic work. And yes, I think this is a fantastic project to highlight the collaboration that actually makes it possible to save a migratory species. So thank you to everybody who was involved in this project, and let's hope that we can continue the work to safeguard the Egyptian vulture. If you want to see Egyptian vultures, you can now sign up to the spring migration count in Galala. Galala is a new bird observatory that we established during this project in Egypt, and our partners from Nature Conservation Egypt have established this as an annual bird migration count, and it runs from mid-February until May. And you can sign up as a volunteer if you would like to join. So this is the link. Maybe we can post it in the Zoom chat as well. And you can join Khaled and Haitham on the rocks above the Red Sea, where you can see thousands of Egyptian vultures and steppe eagles and white storks migrate north during the spring migration. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Bonjour à tous. Je vais faire un petit résumé en français. Alors, Steffen Oppel nous a présenté son projet sur la migration des vautours percnoptères et leur conservation. Steffen a travaillé donc sur ce projet de BirdLife international avec la RSPB. Maintenant, il est scientifique à la Station Ornithologique Suisse où il s'occupe des milans royaux et d'autres espèces. Sa présentation était surtout axée sur deux parties. D'abord, comment ils ont étudié les coûts de la migration chez le vautour percnoptère et comment cette information est utilisée pour la conservation. Donc, le vautour percnoptère est concerné par plus de 40 pays sur ses voies de migration. Il migre forcément pour exploiter des ressources saisonnières. Les coûts de la migration et les avantages par rapport à rester sédentaire sont parfois difficiles à quantifier. Donc, ce qu'ils ont fait, c'est qu'ils ont d'abord comparé des populations migratrices, donc en Espagne, en Andalousie et dans la région de l'Ebre, avec des populations sédentaires, par exemple sur les îles Canaries, Fuerteventura, on a des percnoptères qui ne migrent pas. Et il a montré aussi un exemple similaire avec le milan royal. Donc, il y a des différences entre ces populations. Ensuite, l'exemple aussi de capture répétée au cours de l'année dans une même population. Donc, c'est un exemple avec une autre espèce, le martinet à ventre blanc. C'est quelque chose qui est plus difficile à faire apparemment avec le percnoptère. Entre-temps, on a eu de nombreuses avances technologiques. Et pour étudier les différences entre les voies de migration occidentales et orientales, il y a eu des individus qui ont été équipés par GPS. En Europe de l'Ouest, les oiseaux ont une migration courte vers la Mauritanie et le Mali et ne doivent pas franchir de grosses barrières, alors qu'en Europe de l'Est, il y a un risque de noyade, typiquement depuis les Balkans, donc les oiseaux qui nichent en Grèce ou dans les Balkans occidentaux doivent traverser la mer sur une grande distance et risquent de mourir. Donc, près de 140 individus ont été suivis durant 10 ans, certains jusqu'à 7 ans, donc c'est des données d'une très longue durée. Les données de suivi individuel permettent de définir si un mouvement a lieu. Donc, on a eu une classification si les données ont eu lieu, si une migration a eu lieu durant un mois ou si l'oiseau était stationnaire. Ça a permis donc une approche analytique pour estimer la survie mensuelle et donc de constater une survie plus importante près des sites, une mortalité plus importante près des sites de reproduction. Donc la survie mensuelle n'a pas été affectée par la migration en Europe de l'Ouest. La migration était plus courte, mais une plus grande différence en Europe de l'Est, ainsi qu'en Italie. La survie augmente avec l'âge et la survie est aussi beaucoup plus élevée au sud du Sahara est plus faible durant la migration. Donc, la question, c'est quel est le bénéfice de migrer en Afrique comparé à rester en Europe, surtout pour les adultes. Et les juvéniles donc, ont plus de... Donc, il y a un bénéfice pour les adultes de migrer, mais les juvéniles ont plus de soucis par rapport au franchissement des barrières. Ensuite, les causes de mortalité donc, sont diverses, surtout les voies de migration, notamment l'empoisonnement, l'électrocution, les collisions. Persécution pour les croyances populaires au Nigeria, c'est quelque chose de terrible. Donc, c'est des challenges qui sont insurmontables en ce moment. Et il faut donc une stratégie pour sauver le vautour percnoctaire. Et ce qui a été fait, c'est de lâcher des oiseaux captifs pour gagner du temps en évitant une extinction. Euh, les oiseaux ont été relâchés en Bulgarie orientale où le risque de migration est probablement plus faible. Et les lâchers tardifs au printemps, donc plutôt que de relâcher les oiseaux en automne, on les relâche au printemps suivant, se sont montrés plus efficaces que les autres types de lâchers. Stéphane a présenté une modélisation pour les prochaines 10, 20 ou 30 ans. Il faudrait donc, pour garder la population, une survie de 4% meilleure que celle actuellement et relâcher de 5 à 10 individus par année ou une augmentation de la survie annuelle de 8% sans lâcher additionnel. Donc, à partir de ce constat, on constate qu'il faut absolument diminuer la mortalité. Et donc, il y a eu différentes mesures qui ont été prises, des recherches d'appâts empoisonnés avec des patrouilles de chiens dans les Balkans, une sécurisation des lignes, des lignes électriques dans 8 pays, et d'autres actions multiples pour réduire la persécution directe de ces oiseaux. Grâce à tout ça, la population s'est stabilisée à partir de 2018 à un peu plus de 100 couples. Donc, on peut voir qu'il faut conserver les oiseaux par différentes mesures à différents endroits, avec une action continue sur tous les fronts. Et donc, c'est un bel exemple d'un projet de conservation qui a évité l'extinction locale d'une espèce. Ensuite, je ne vais pas aller trop dans les détails, mais en gros, Stéphane a remercié aussi tous les partenaires du projet et fait une annonce pour un comptage de migration printanière en Égypte, auquel vous pouvez participer. Merci. Merci Stéphane pour la belle présentation.